She was only 17 when the door closed behind her in the middle of the coldest winter anyone could remember. The temperature kept falling, the town kept freezing, and no one knew that beneath the snow she was building something that wasn't supposed to work. The winter came early that year, and it came wrong. By December, the ground was already locked solid. Snow didn't melt between storms. It stacked. Wind stripped heat from anything exposed, and nights fell so cold that sound itself seemed to disappear. Old-timers stopped guessing temperatures and started checking on neighbors instead. When the number finally settled, it stayed there, -15 Fahrenheit, sometimes lower. That was the night Lena Holt was told to leave. She was 17, still legally a child, though no one treated her like one. Small-framed, quiet, with hair she cut herself and hands rough from chores, Lena had never taken up much space. She learned early that being unnoticed was safer than being in the way. Her stepfather's words were short, practical, final. You can't stay here anymore. There was no argument, no raised voices, just the sound of boots by the door and the cold waiting patiently outside. Lena stepped into the snow wearing 2 sweaters, borrowed boots that didn't fit right, and a coat with a torn lining. The wind hit her immediately, cutting through layers like they were paper. Behind her, the house glowed with yellow light, heat, walls, safety that was no longer hers. Most people would have walked toward town. Lena didn't. She went downhill. Years earlier, she'd noticed something while helping dig a root cellar behind the house. Even in deep winter, the earth below the surface didn't feel like the air above it. It was heavy, still, cold, yes, but not deadly. Snow on top made it quieter, warmer. Animals knew this. They disappeared underground when winter became serious. Lena followed the same instinct. She found a low spot near a frozen creek, shielded on 3 sides by earth. The wind passed overhead instead of through it. Snow had already drifted deep there, forming a natural wall. She dropped her pack, knelt, and pressed her bare hand into the ground. It was hard, but not lifeless. This was where she would stay. She didn't build up, she built down. Using a shovel she'd hidden weeks earlier, preparation she'd never explained to anyone, Lena carved into the frozen soil inch by inch. She worked slowly, resting often, breathing carefully to avoid sweating. Sweat killed people in cold like this. She hollowed a space just large enough to sit, then deepened it until her shoulders fit below ground level. Snow fell continuously, erasing her tracks as fast as she made them. By nightfall, the wind roared above her, but inside the shallow pit it barely reached her face. She stacked blocks of packed snow along the exposed side, sealing gaps with ice and slush. The walls grew thicker, heavier, safer. What most people brushed away from their houses, she pulled closer. Snow wasn't weakness, it was insulation. She shaped the entrance low, forcing herself to crawl. Standing wasted heat, height wasted warmth. The ceiling curved inward, trapping air the way an animal burrow did. She lined the floor with pine branches, then another layer of snow hardened smooth with her gloves. When she finally crawled inside, Lena didn't cry. There wasn't energy for that. She lit a small candle, shielding the flame with her hands. The light barely moved the darkness, but it was enough to see the walls. Ice slick, uneven, close. The space felt impossibly small, claustrophobic to anyone used to rooms and furniture and doors that closed properly. To Lena, it felt controlled. Outside, the temperature dropped further. Wind screamed across open fields, tearing heat from houses built tall and proud. Pipes froze, furnaces failed, roofs groaned under weight they were never meant to carry. People huddled together in living rooms that grew colder by the hour. Inside the sunken shelter, the air changed, slowly, quietly. Lena wrapped her coat tighter and sat with her back against the earth, knees drawn in. Her breath no longer formed sharp clouds. The walls stopped biting at her skin. The cold didn't leave, but it stopped advancing. She reached into her pack and pulled out a small thermometer she'd taken from the cellar months earlier. She pressed it into the snow wall and waited. The needle climbed, not fast, not dramatically, but enough. Outside, -15°F. Inside, the snow and earth shelter, climbing past freezing. Lena closed her eyes. She had been kicked out into the coldest winter of her life. And she had built something no one else would have believed in, using the very thing that was killing everyone else. The storm hadn't even reached its worst yet, and somehow she was still warm enough to sleep. The storm deepened after midnight. Wind pressed down instead of sideways now, forcing snow into every crack and hollow. Out in the open, fences vanished first, then roads, then entire yards. By morning, even familiar landmarks were erased, flattened into a single white surface that offered no sense of direction or scale. The cold stayed steady at -15°F, the kind that didn't shock anymore because it never left. Lena woke to silence. Not calm silence, buried silence. The sound of wind was gone. The howl overhead had softened into a distant pressure, like the world had been wrapped in layers too thick to penetrate. She shifted slightly and felt resistance from every side. Snow had piled over the shelter during the night, sealing it deeper into the ground. Her house had disappeared. She didn't panic. Panic burned air too fast. Panic demanded movement. Lena stayed still and listened to her breathing until it slowed again. The candle she'd extinguished before sleeping still sat beside her, unbroken. The thermometer rested against the wall, its needle hovering just above freezing, not warm, but alive. She relit the candle carefully. The flame was small, controlled. It added almost no heat, but it confirmed something important. There was still air. The shelter was breathing the way she'd designed it to. Snow above her didn't suffocate the space. It protected it. Hours passed without markers. Inside the shelter, time didn't behave the way it did in houses with windows and clocks. Light never changed. Sound never returned. Lena measured time by her own needs: hunger, thirst, stiffness in her legs. She melted snow in a tin cup using the candle and rationed the food she'd brought. Every action was deliberate, nothing wasted. Above her, the storm continued reshaping the land. In town, people woke to doors they couldn't open. Snow pressed so hard against houses that windows cracked inward. Furnaces ran non-stop and still lost ground. Some families retreated into single rooms, sealing off hallways they couldn't keep warm. Others burned through fuel by mid-morning and had nowhere left to turn. No one saw Lena's shelter. They walked past it without realizing it was there. By the second night, the temperature dropped further after sunset. The cold found its way into every exposed structure. But underground, surrounded by earth and packed snow, the change was slower. The shelter absorbed the drop instead of reacting to it. Lena felt it as a gradual tightening rather than a shock. She pulled the blanket tighter and shifted closer to the wall. Her breath fogged faintly, then less. The thermometer climbed again, not to comfort, but to survival. Somewhere nearby, a structure failed. The sound reached her as a dull, distant crack transmitted through the ground. Lena flinched once, then settled back. Collapse sounded different when it wasn't happening to you. It sounded final, heavy. Her shelter didn't answer it. The walls held, the ceiling stayed firm, snow above compressed, increasing insulation instead of weight. What would have crushed a roof only sealed her in tighter. By the third day, hunger became a steady presence rather than a sharp pain. Thirst stayed manageable. Cold was no longer the main threat. Stillness was. Loneliness pressed in harder than the temperature ever had. Lena talked quietly to herself sometimes, just to hear a human voice. She planned movements she wouldn't need to make, counted breaths, counted heartbeats. She did not think about the house she'd been forced out of. Thinking about warmth you don't have is dangerous. On the fourth morning, light returned, faintly. A pale glow filtered through the entrance tunnel, diffused by layers of snow. The storm was weakening. Wind had shifted direction. The pressure overhead eased slightly, enough for sound to begin creeping back into the world. Lena checked the thermometer again. It rested just below 60 Fahrenheit. She laughed once, short, quiet, almost surprised. Above her, people were digging out homes that no longer worked. Roofs were being shoveled, pipes thawed and refroze. Livestock was found frozen where it had stood. Roads were still impassable, help delayed, systems overwhelmed. And beneath the snow, a 17-year-old girl sat inside a house no one believed could exist. Warm enough to survive, invisible enough to be left alone. Her shelter hadn't just protected her from the storm, it had hidden her from a world that never thought to look down. And when the snow finally stopped falling, Lena Holt was still there, waiting, breathing, and very much alive, inside a house made from the cold itself. The storm ended the way it always did, without warning. One morning, the wind simply wasn't there. Snow fell straight down instead of sideways. The sky lightened into a flat, colorless gray that made everything look unfinished. The temperature stayed brutally low, but the violence had passed. What remained was damage. In town, people emerged cautiously, pushing doors that resisted, climbing through windows when they had to. Snow lay chest-high in places, packed so hard it had to be chipped away instead of shoveled. Rooflines sagged, chimneys leaned. Entire buildings looked smaller, as if winter had pressed them downward. Generators rattled weakly. Radios crackled with partial messages. Names were called out and sometimes not answered. Lena felt the change before she heard it. The pressure above her eased. Sound began to travel again. Muffled footsteps, metal scraping snow, distant voices carried strangely through the ground. She waited another full hour before moving. Storms ended suddenly. Cold mistakes lasted longer. When she finally crawled toward the entrance tunnel, her shoulders brushed snow walls that had hardened like stone. She pushed carefully, breaking through the outer crust one layer at a time. Light spilled in all at once, blinding after days underground. Cold rushed in, real cold, open-air cold. Lena pulled herself out slowly, standing for the first time in days. The world felt too big, too loud. Snow stretched in every direction, broken only by jagged shapes that used to be houses. She took 2 steps and stopped, dizzy, steadying herself against the packed wall of her shelter. From a distance, it didn't look like a house at all. Just a low rise in the snow. Uneven, accidental, something you'd step over without noticing. That's why no one had come sooner. A man down the slope froze mid-step when he saw her. He stared the way people do when their brain can't immediately explain what their eyes are reporting. A girl, standing, alive, coming out of the ground. "Where did you come from?" he asked, not moving any closer. Lena pointed behind her. They didn't believe her at first. More people gathered. Neighbors, volunteers, men sent to check for survivors. They walked right past the mound before she stopped them. When she showed them the entrance and brushed snow aside, warm air spilled out, visible even in the cold. Someone swore under their breath. They crouched one by one, peering inside. Earth walls, snow blocks, a curved ceiling stained with candle smoke. No wiring, no furnace, no sign that this should have worked at all. And yet it had. A thermometer hung from a nail pressed into frozen soil. One of the men wiped frost from its face and stared. "Well, I'll be damned," he said quietly. Around them, people were pulling frozen furniture from houses that had been built to last generations. Pipes lay split open. Roof beams snapped under weight they were never designed to carry. Everything tall had suffered. Everything proud had paid for it. Lena's shelter had done the opposite. It had disappeared. News spread fast in small places, not dramatically, just steadily, carried by boots and breath. People came to look. They asked questions. They crouched low, uncomfortable in a space that forced humility. Some nodded without speaking. Others shook their heads, unsettled. A few asked why she'd built it that way. Lena didn't lecture. "The ground doesn't lose heat like air does," she said once. "Snow keeps wind out." That was all. By nightfall, lanterns glowed again across the valley. Some homes were salvaged, others weren't. Names were written down, losses counted. Winter added its numbers to the ledger. Lena was offered a place to stay. She thanked them, said she'd think about it. That night, she went back into the shelter she'd built herself. The entrance felt smaller now that the world had reopened. The warmth returned slowly, familiarly. She sat with her back against the earth and listened to the distant sounds of rebuilding. For days, people had searched everywhere except the ground beneath their feet. And in that blind spot, quiet, compressed, ignored, Lena Holt had survived the coldest winter of her life inside a house made from snow, earth, and the simple decision to build where no one else thought to look. After the storm, the cold changed character. It was no longer violent, no screaming wind, no snow that erased landmarks in minutes. Instead, winter settled into the land the way a weight settles into wood, slow, constant, impossible to ignore. Days stayed below freezing, nights dropped hard and fast. What had broken during the storm now revealed whether it could be fixed at all. Lena stayed close to her shelter. People assumed she would leave it behind once help arrived, that it had been a desperate thing meant only for crisis. But desperation hadn't built it. Attention had. And attention didn't disappear just because the storm did. She cleared the entrance properly for the first time, carving steps where she'd once crawled. She widened the tunnel slightly, just enough to move without scraping her shoulders. She added a second snow wall inside the first, creating a pocket of trapped air that made the interior steadier at night. Small changes, careful ones. She did not make it bigger. Bigger was tempting now. People suggested it constantly. "You proved it works," they said. "Now make it comfortable." Lena shook her head. Comfort invited waste. Waste invited cold. In town, repairs moved slowly. Roofs were shoveled clean only to sag again under fresh snowfall. Pipes thawed during the day and burst at night. Families closed off rooms they couldn't heat, living in kitchens and hallways like temporary camps inside their own houses. Fuel was still limited. Everyone learned restraint the hard way. More than once, someone walked past Lena's shelter without realizing she was inside it. From a distance, it still looked like part of the landscape, snow smoothed by wind, earth holding its shape without complaint. That invisibility had become one of its strengths. No drafts, no exposure, no invitation for the cold to enter. At night, when the valley darkened and the temperature fell again, Lena lit her candle and sat quietly. The shelter warmed slowly, evenly. The walls absorbed heat instead of rejecting it. She slept without shivering, without dreaming of escape. Some evenings, voices carried from town. Laughter, arguments, exhaustion, life continuing in uneven steps. Lena listened, but did not join. She wasn't hiding anymore. She just didn't feel the need to explain herself. A few people began copying what they could. A root cellar insulated with snow instead of cleared bare. A shed built into a slope instead of standing alone. A child's playhouse lowered and packed tight against wind. No one announced where the ideas came from. They didn't need to. Winter had demonstrated their value already. Lena's stepfather never came looking for her. She thought about that once, briefly, while watching smoke drift upward from her stoveless shelter. Just breath and candle warmth escaping slowly into the air. Then she let the thought pass. Cold had a way of simplifying what mattered. By late winter, the ground began to soften beneath the snow. Meltwater froze and refroze, creating layers that cracked underfoot. It was the most dangerous time, not dramatic, just careless. Slips, falls, exposure from damp clothes. Lena adjusted again. She dug a shallow drainage channel around the shelter's upper edge, guiding meltwater away so it wouldn't seep inside. She raised her sleeping platform slightly, using packed snow hardened smooth. Every change respected the original idea. Stay low, stay sealed, stay small. The shelter had outlived the storm. Now it was outliving the season. When people talked about the winter later, they focused on the days when everything failed at once. But Lena knew the truth was quieter. Survival didn't end when the wind stopped. It continued in decisions made afterward, whether to rush back to old habits or learn from what had almost killed you. She chose the second. And while winter slowly loosened its grip on the land, the house made of snow and earth remained exactly what it had always been. Not impressive, not visible, not large, just enough to keep her alive. By the time the snow began to soften, winter had already decided what it would take with it. It wasn't dramatic anymore. No collapsing roofs, no whiteouts, just the slow, grinding work of thaw and refreeze. Ice formed under snow and waited for careless steps. Water seeped into cracks that had survived the storm, then expanded at night. This was the phase that punished impatience. Lena stayed careful. She rose later in the mornings now, letting the first weak sun do some of the work the candle no longer needed to. The shelter held its temperature with less effort, the earth releasing stored warmth gradually, like it had been saving it for her. She opened the entrance only when necessary, resealing it afterward. Winter might have been loosening its grip, but it hadn't let go. In town, people were tired in a new way, not afraid, not panicked, just worn down. The storm had passed, but its cost kept surfacing: ruined lumber, dead animals, repairs that couldn't wait for better weather. Some families moved in together to save fuel. Others abandoned parts of their homes entirely, living in one or two rooms that could still be kept warm. And quietly, without anyone announcing it, people began to look at the ground differently. They noticed how snow stayed longer against certain walls, how basements remained warmer than living rooms, how sheds built into slopes survived better than those standing alone. These weren't lessons taught in words. They were learned by watching what had not failed. Lena became part of the landscape again. Not a mystery this time, not a rumor, just a presence. People passed her on the path to town and nodded. Sometimes they stopped to ask simple questions. Not how did you survive, but how deep is it? How thick are the walls? Does the snow ever leak? She answered honestly, briefly. She never framed it as wisdom, just observation. By early spring, patches of earth showed through on south-facing slopes. The creek near her shelter began to murmur again beneath thinning ice. Birds returned in small numbers, testing the air. The valley exhaled. Lena stood outside her shelter one morning and realized she hadn't shivered in days. The thermometer inside no longer felt like proof of survival. It felt ordinary, and that, she understood, was the real marker of success. When something stops feeling miraculous and starts feeling dependable. Someone asked her once what she planned to do next. She didn't answer right away. Plans were loud. Winter had taught her the value of quiet continuity. She would leave the shelter eventually. She knew that. Snow houses were honest about their limits. They worked because they accepted the season they were built for. But the idea behind it, the choice to build with cold instead of against it, that wasn't seasonal. That stayed. When the ground finally thawed enough to dig without striking ice, Lena dismantled nothing. She didn't need to. The shelter would melt back into the land on its own, returning the snow and earth exactly where they'd come from. No debris, no scar. Just a memory held by a few people who had learned to look down instead of outward. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the temperature dropped one last time, Lena sat at the entrance and watched shadows stretch across the valley. Houses still stood wounded, rooflines uneven, repairs incomplete. Her shelter, almost gone now, had already finished its job. The coldest winter of her life had taken a home from her, but it had given her something quieter in return. The knowledge that survival didn't require permission, and that sometimes the strongest place to stand is the one no one else thinks to build. Spring never announced itself. It simply arrived one small surrender at a time. Snow retreated first from the edges of things, fence posts, rocks, the dark side of trees. Then the ground softened enough to leave footprints that didn't immediately freeze back into place. The cold still returned at night, but it no longer carried authority. It came like a reminder, not a threat. Lena watched her shelter fade. The curved ceiling sagged slightly as the snow lost its hardness. The walls, once tight and solid, began to darken with moisture. Water traced slow paths downward and vanished into the soil. What had protected her so completely now did exactly what it was meant to do. It disappeared. She didn't rush the ending. She never had. Each morning she checked the entrance, brushed away meltwater, sat for a while inside the space that had once been her entire world. It still smelled faintly of earth and candle smoke. It still felt quiet in a way houses rarely do, but it was done. In town, life moved forward unevenly. Some homes were repaired, others were sold, abandoned, or quietly divided as families adapted to what they could afford to keep warm. No one spoke much about the storm anymore. People prefer lessons they don't have to explain, yet the changes were visible. Sheds built lower, basements insulated instead of ignored. Snow left, piled against certain walls, instead of shoveled away immediately. The valley looked the same from a distance, but it behaved differently now. Lena packed lightly when she finally left the shelter for good. There was nothing to take with her that mattered. The cold had already stripped her down to essentials. She carried that instead. She didn't confront the house she'd been kicked out of. She didn't need closure from it. Winter had already answered every question worth asking. It had shown her who would close a door and what she could build without one. Years later, people would still mention that winter when temperatures dropped unusually low. Someone would always say, "Remember that girl?" Not with awe, not with disbelief, just recognition. Because what Lena had done wasn't magic, it was attention. She had listened to the land instead of tradition. She had trusted physics over pride. She had built something temporary that worked perfectly for the moment it was needed, and then let it go. That was the part most people missed. Survival wasn't the shelter. Survival was knowing when enough was enough. When winter came again, and it always did, the valley faced it a little differently. Not braver, not louder, just quieter, lower, more careful. And somewhere in that change lived the proof that being abandoned in the cold does not mean being powerless. Sometimes it means you finally build on your own terms, and that is warmer than any house meant to last forever.